The year was 1883, and the Wyoming Territory was suffering through the most devastating drought in decades. Cattle dropped dead in the fields, creeks dried to dusty scars across the land, and ranchers watched their fortunes wither like the parched grass beneath their boots. It was against this unforgiving backdrop that an extraordinary tale of love, betrayal, and justice unfolded, one that would become legendary throughout the frontier. Have you ever wondered what happens when two unlikely souls find connection in the harshest circumstances? Can a person's worth truly be measured beyond the color of their skin or the number of years they've walked this earth? This remarkable story might just change how you view the power of human connection. If you're intrigued by tales of frontier justice and unexpected alliances, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more extraordinary true stories from America's wild past. Jackson Reeves was a man whose silence spoke volumes. At 32, his hands told the story his lips rarely shared, calloused from years of rope work, scarred from breaking wild horses, strong from building a life in a world determined to break him. As the son of freed slaves who had journeyed west after the Civil War, Jackson had learned early that in this new territory, actions carried more weight than words. His father had taught him to ride before he could properly walk, whispering horse wisdom that seemed to flow directly from some ancient knowledge. "Horses don't care about the color of your skin," his father would say. "They care about the steadiness of your hands and the calmness in your heart." By the time Jackson turned 15, he could gentle the most stubborn Mustang in half the time of men twice his age. At 20, he could move a herd through treacherous mountain passes without losing a single head. Yet despite his exceptional skills, Jackson found himself taking whatever work came his way, watching white men with half his ability secure permanent positions on prestigious ranches. When the small outfit he'd been riding for went bankrupt in the early months of the drought, Jackson found himself with nothing but his horse, saddle, and reputation. He traveled from ranch to ranch, offering his services at rates that made him affordable during desperate times. Some doors closed before he could speak, others opened just wide enough for temporary work before he was sent on his way. With winter approaching and prospects dwindling, Jackson heard whispers about Thornhill Ranch, 50,000 acres of the finest grazing land in 3 counties, owned by a woman who cared more about competence than convention. Margaret Thornhill stood on the wide porch of her ranch house each dawn, surveying her domain with eyes that missed nothing. At 70 years old, her body had begun to bend like a wind-shaped pine, but her mind remained sharp as a new-honed blade. The locals called her the Thornhill Widow, though never within earshot. She'd buried 2 husbands and an only son, outliving those who thought they'd inherit her empire. She'd arrived in Wyoming Territory in 1835 as a young bride of 22, full of Eastern refinement and naive dreams. The frontier had stripped away those pretensions quickly. When cholera took her first husband 3 years later, leaving her with an infant son and 200 acres, neighboring ranchers gave her 6 months before she'd sell and return east. Instead, Margaret learned to brand cattle, negotiate water rights, and shoot straight. She married again at 30, a strategic alliance with a cattle baron 20 years her senior. When he died 15 years later, she combined their holdings and expanded aggressively, buying land from failed ranchers at pennies on the dollar. Her son, groomed to take over the empire she'd built, died in a hunting accident at 28. The tragedy hollowed something inside Margaret, leaving a void that she filled with more land, more cattle, and an ironclad reputation for ruthless business dealings. Now, as drought threatened everything she'd built, Margaret faced each day with grim determination. She'd already sold off a quarter of her herd at devastating losses, dismissed half her ranch hands to cut costs, and still the rain refused to come. Each morning, she received reports of more dead cattle, more dried-up water holes, more neighboring ranches failing. "Ma'am," her foreman reported that fateful morning, "we've got another 20 head down in the south pasture. And there's a man at the bunkhouse looking for work." The first meeting between Jackson Reeves and Margaret Thornhill crackled with the tension of 2 strong-willed individuals taking each other's measure. Margaret sat behind her massive oak desk, a relic hauled by oxcart from St. Louis decades earlier. Jackson stood before her, hat in hand but spine straight, his eyes meeting hers directly, a boldness that would have earned most men of color a swift rebuke. "My foreman says you claim to be the best horseman in 3 territories," Margaret said, her voice carrying the rasp of years giving orders across windswept plains. "I didn't claim that," Jackson replied evenly. "I said I could work cattle better than most." A hint of appreciation flickered across Margaret's weathered face. She despised boasting almost as much as she despised incompetence. "We're losing cattle daily," she stated bluntly. "I need hands who can work hard, follow orders, and accept lower wages until this drought breaks." Jackson nodded once. "I understand the situation." Margaret leaned forward, fixing him with a penetrating stare. "I don't care what color you are," she told him bluntly. "Can you move 300 head through Devil's Canyon without losing more than 10? "Yes, ma'am," Jackson replied without hesitation. "I can do it with losing none." Margaret's expression remained impassive, but something shifted in her eyes, a recognition of the quiet confidence that came not from bravado but experience. "You'll get room, board, and half wages until we see rain," she said. "Prove yourself useful, and there might be a permanent position." Jackson nodded again. "That's fair." As he turned to leave, Margaret added, "The men bunk together. If that's going to be a problem for anyone, they can find work elsewhere." "Won't be a problem for me," Jackson replied. "Can't speak for others." Margaret's mouth twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "I don't expect you to." The transformation from employer and employee to something more complex began gradually, like a creek bed slowly filling after the first rain. Jackson proved his worth immediately, working longer hours than any other hand and solving problems before they escalated. Within weeks, the other ranch hands, initially wary, began seeking his advice on breaking difficult horses or treating cattle ailments. Margaret noticed. She began appearing at the corral when Jackson worked with the horses, observing his methods with keen interest. One evening, as Jackson finished gentling a particularly stubborn colt, he looked up to find Margaret watching from the fence. "My first husband had a way with horses," she remarked. "Not as good as yours, but similar in approach." Coming from Margaret, this qualified as effusive praise. Jackson nodded his thanks. "Would you join me on the porch?" she asked, the invitation surprising them both. "The evenings get long." That first conversation lasted until the stars emerged in full glory above the ranch. Margaret spoke of her early days in the territory, the challenges of being a woman in a man's world. Jackson shared stories of his parents' determination to own land despite the obstacles placed before them. "My father died believing his son would someday have what was denied to him," Jackson said quietly. "His own piece of this country." Margaret nodded, understanding ambition and legacy in ways few others could. "This land doesn't care who works it, only that the work gets done right." These evening conversations became a ritual. As summer faded into early autumn, the drought continued, but a different kind of thaw occurred between the aging ranch owner and the skilled horseman. The ranch hands noticed the change in their employer, the permanent furrow between her brows occasionally relaxed, and rare moments of dry humor emerged in her interactions. Have you ever witnessed an unexpected friendship bloom in the most unlikely soil? Share your thoughts in the comments below about connections that transcend age, background, or circumstance. When the first snow fell in early October, it brought momentary relief from the drought but a new crisis to Thornhill Ranch. Margaret, who had ridden out to check on a remote line cabin during the sudden storm, returned with a chill that quickly developed into pneumonia. The doctor from town, summoned at great expense, gave a grim prognosis. At her age, with this severity of infection, he told the foreman within Jackson's hearing, "I'd be surprised if she lasts the week. Keep her comfortable. That's all we can do." That night, after the doctor departed, Jackson positioned a chair outside Margaret's bedroom door. The housekeeper, an older woman who had served Margaret for decades, raised an eyebrow but said nothing as she brought him coffee throughout the night. On the third night of Margaret's illness, when her fever burned hottest, Jackson heard her calling out, not in delirium, but with clear purpose. When he entered her bedroom, Margaret's eyes locked onto his with feverish intensity. She gripped his hand with surprising strength. "They're waiting for me to die," she whispered, her voice barely audible above her labored breathing. "My nephew from Boston, the banker in town, vultures, all of them, circling for what's mine." "You're not dying," Jackson assured her, though the rattle in her chest suggested otherwise. "Margaret," she corrected him, using her first name as an offering. "And I know when my time's coming." She pulled him closer. "I built this ranch. I won't see it carved up and sold to the highest bidder." Jackson stayed by her side until dawn, listening as Margaret revealed her fears. Her nephew Charles had gambled away his inheritance years ago and now eyed her ranch as his salvation. The local banker had approached her repeatedly with generous offers to buy her land, offers that would have given him control of the water rights for the entire valley. "They think because I'm old and alone, I'll be easy prey," Margaret rasped. "They've never understood what it took to build all this." As morning light filtered through the curtains, Margaret's fever broke. She fell into a deep, healing sleep, still clutching Jackson's hand. The following morning, Margaret summoned the preacher and her lawyer to her bedside. The men arrived expecting to take her final confession and record her last will. Instead, they found Margaret propped up against her pillows, weak but clear-eyed, with Jackson standing quietly by the window. "I intend to marry Jackson Reeves," Margaret announced without preamble. "Today." The silence that followed was absolute. The preacher recovered first, his face flushing with indignation. "Mrs. Thornhill, surely in your condition, the fever must still be affecting your judgment." The lawyer stepped forward. "Margaret, as your legal advisor and friend of 30 years, I must question your capacity to make such a significant decision while ill." Margaret's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Are you suggesting I'm not of sound mind, Henry?" The lawyer backpedaled immediately. "Of course not, but—" "Then perform your duties," Margaret cut him off. "Reverend, you will conduct the ceremony now. Henry, you will witness it and ensure all legal documents reflect my marriage." The men exchanged alarmed glances. The preacher cleared his throat. "Mrs. Thornhill, there are considerations, social implications, the community will." "The community has fed off my generosity for decades," Margaret interrupted. "I've donated to your church, funded the school, and provided work for half the men in the county. I'm not asking permission." As the men continued to sputter objections, Jackson moved to Margaret's bedside. Leaning down, he asked quietly, "Are you certain?" Margaret's eyes, clear despite her illness, met his. "More certain than I've been about anything in 20 years. The ceremony proceeded with minimal ceremony. The preacher spoke the words as if each one pained him, while the lawyer scribbled notes with a trembling hand. The housekeeper and foreman served as additional witnesses, their expressions carefully neutral. When it was done, Margaret Thornhill became Margaret Reeves, and Jackson, the son of slaves who had never dared dream of land ownership, became the legal partner of the largest ranch in the territory. For 5 precious days, it seemed the unlikely couple might defy all expectations. Margaret's health improved steadily, her breathing easing and strength returning incrementally. Jackson moved into the main house but maintained a respectful distance, sleeping in an adjoining room and focusing on ranch operations. To the surprise of many, Jackson stepped into his new role with natural authority. His knowledge of cattle and land management impressed even the most skeptical ranch hands. He reviewed the account books with Margaret each evening, discussing strategies to weather the ongoing drought and rebuild the herd come spring. "You have a head for business," Margaret observed on the 5th evening, as they sat reviewing cattle prices. "Better than either of my husbands." Jackson smiled slightly. "My mother taught me figures. Said numbers don't lie even when people do." Margaret nodded approvingly. "Smart woman." The ranch hands, initially shocked by the marriage, began to adjust to the new reality. Jackson's fair treatment and clear instructions earned grudging respect. A few hands quit immediately after the wedding, unable to accept taking orders from a black man, but most stayed. Jobs were too scarce during the drought to abandon steady employment over pride. In town, however, reactions ranged from disbelief to outrage. The banker, Mr. Hargrove, was particularly vocal about the scandal and the obvious exploitation of an elderly woman. The sheriff, a longtime associate of Hargrove's, nodded in solemn agreement whenever such sentiments were expressed. What do you think will happen next in this frontier drama? Will the community accept this unconventional union, or are darker forces already at work? Keep watching to discover how this remarkable story unfolds. On the 6th day after the wedding, two significant events occurred that would alter everything. First, a telegram arrived from Boston announcing the imminent arrival of Charles Thornhill, Margaret's nephew, who had not visited the ranch in 15 years. The telegram expressed deep concern about his aunt's health and disturbing rumors reaching him back east. Margaret read the message with a grim expression. "He's coming for the ranch," she told Jackson. "He always thought he'd inherit it all." That same afternoon, as dusk approached, a ranch hand spotted smoke rising from the western pasture, the most distant section of the property. The cry of "fire" sent every available man racing to prevent the blaze from spreading to the main buildings or, worse, the drought-parched grasslands that could carry flames for miles. Jackson organized the response, directing men to create fire breaks and move any nearby cattle to safety. The fire had started suspiciously far from any natural causes, but there was no time to investigate its origin as the flames, fed by dry brush and rising winds, grew rapidly. For hours, the men battled the blaze, finally containing it as midnight approached. Exhausted, smoke-stained, and parched, Jackson returned to the main house to report their success to Margaret. The house stood eerily quiet. The housekeeper, who should have been attending to Margaret, was nowhere to be found. Jackson took the stairs two at a time, an inexplicable dread building with each step. He found Margaret in her bed, still and silent. Not from her illness, but from a pillow pressed over her face with enough force to end her life. The woman who had survived the harshest frontier conditions for decades, outlived 2 husbands, and built an empire through sheer determination had been murdered in her own home while everyone fought a conveniently timed fire. The sheriff arrived before dawn, accompanied by 4 deputies and Mr. Hargrove, the banker. Their grim faces suggested they had already determined guilt before investigation began. "Mighty convenient fire," the sheriff remarked, circling Jackson like a predator. Drawing everyone away from the house. Jackson stood silent, grief and rage warring within him. He had known Margaret for less than 3 months, been married to her for less than a week, yet her death left a hollow ache that surprised him with its intensity. The sheriff ordered a search of the main house and Jackson's former quarters in the bunkhouse. In Margaret's desk, they discovered documents suggesting Jackson had been systematically stealing from the ranch for months, documents Margaret had supposedly been compiling as evidence. More damning still, beneath the floorboards in Jackson's old bunkhouse room, they found a significant sum of money Jackson insisted he had never seen before. "You expect us to believe the Thornhill widow just happened to marry you out of affection?" the sheriff scoffed. "A woman known for counting every penny suddenly takes a shine to a drifting cowhand young enough to be her son. Then ends up dead less than a week after making you her heir." By morning, Jackson Reeves was in jail, charged with the murder of his wife of less than a week. The cell, built specifically for men of his color, sat separately from the main jail, smaller, darker, and visible to passers-by who could freely offer opinions on his guilt. Charles Thornhill arrived the following day, stepping off the train in a fine Eastern suit that immediately marked him as an outsider. At 45, he carried himself with the practiced confidence of a man accustomed to deference, though the slight paunch and redness around his nose hinted at indulgent living. He expressed appropriate grief for an aunt he barely knew and immediate concern for the future of the ranch he expected to inherit. Within hours of his arrival, he was ensconced in the banker's office, discussing the unfortunate situation and the necessary steps to transfer ownership. Of course, the marriage was clearly a fraud, Hargrove assured him. No court will uphold such an obvious scheme. Once the cowhand hangs for murder, the estate will naturally pass to you as next of kin. Charles nodded, satisfied. How long will the trial take? I have business interests back east that require attention. Justice moves swiftly in these parts, the sheriff, who had joined them, replied with a meaningful look. Especially in clear-cut cases like this one. What none of them realized was that Margaret, suspicious by nature and experienced in betrayal, had taken precautions. The night before her death, she had given her most trusted ranch hand, a man who had worked for her for 20 years, a sealed letter to deliver to her lawyer in case anything happened to her. Henry Wilson, Margaret's lawyer of 30 years, broke the seal on the envelope with trembling fingers. Though he had initially opposed her marriage to Jackson, his loyalty to Margaret herself had never wavered. The contents of the letter left him pale and shaken. The first pages contained evidence of Charles's embezzlement from family businesses back east, his mounting gambling debts, and his correspondence with Hargrove discussing plans to sell the ranch immediately upon Margaret's death. Most damning was a letter from Charles to Hargrove dated 6 months earlier, discussing how they might accelerate the old woman's demise, if her health didn't fail naturally soon. The final page contained Margaret's own statement: "If I die under suspicious circumstances, Charles should be the first suspect. He has everything to gain and has threatened me directly in the past when I refused to bail him out of gambling debts. I do not make this accusation lightly, but I know my nephew's character." She continued, "My marriage to Jackson Reeves is not a whim or delusion. He has shown me more respect and genuine care than any man since my son died. I trust him to preserve what I've built rather than dismantle it for quick profit. Should anything happen to me, I ask you to defend him with all legal means at your disposal." Wilson sat back, stunned by both the evidence and the clear affection in Margaret's words for her new husband. After a moment's consideration, he reached for his hat and coat. His first stop would be the jail, followed by a visit to the judge. As Jackson awaited trial in his cell, the trusted ranch hand who had delivered Margaret's letter came forward with additional information. He requested a meeting with the judge and the newly appointed special investigator from the territorial capital. "I saw Mr. Charles near the western pasture shortly before the fire started," he testified. He claimed to be taking a ride to reacquaint himself with the old homestead, but he was coming from the direction where the fire began, riding fast. The ranch hand also revealed that Charles had visited the ranch secretly 3 days before Margaret fell ill, claiming to be a cattle buyer from Cheyenne. He spent most of his time asking questions about the household routine, who slept where, and when the hands would be away from the main house. The special investigator, a former Pinkerton detective with no ties to local interests, began connecting the evidence. He interviewed the housekeeper, who admitted being paid to leave her post on the night of the murder. He examined the financial records showing Charles's desperate situation and the banker's overextended loans. Most crucially, he discovered that the documents found in Margaret's desk were forgeries, the handwriting similar but not identical to hers, and the paper newer than her usual stationery. Within days, the case against Jackson began to crumble, while evidence against Charles, Hargrove, and even the sheriff mounted. The judge, concerned about local corruption, ordered Jackson released into the lawyer's custody to attend Margaret's funeral, a decision that outraged those who had already determined his guilt. The final confrontation came not in a courtroom but at the ranch itself. Charles, realizing his plan was unraveling, attempted to flee with what valuables he could gather from the main house. He was intercepted by Jackson, who had come to pay his respects at Margaret's grave on the hillside overlooking the ranch. Their confrontation drew every resident within miles. Charles, cornered and desperate, revealed the full extent of his scheme, the years of planning, the alliance with the banker and sheriff, and his certainty that no one would believe a black cowboy over a Boston businessman with the right connections. "You think these people care about the truth?" Charles sneered, gesturing to the gathered crowd. "They see what they want to see. A man like you could never own all this." Jackson remained calm, his voice steady. "I never wanted to own it. I wanted to protect it, just as she asked me to." As Charles lunged for his hidden weapon, the special investigator and his deputies emerged from the crowd. Charles was arrested on the spot, his public confession witnessed by dozens. In the aftermath, Margaret's true plan became clear. Her marriage to Jackson hadn't been merely a deathbed impulse but a calculated move to protect her legacy from the nephew she had long distrusted. Her updated will, properly witnessed and filed with the territorial court, left the ranch to Jackson with specific provisions. The land must remain intact for at least 20 years, a portion of profits would establish a school for children of all races, and longtime employees would receive pensions. She knew exactly what she was doing, her lawyer explained to the astonished townsfolk. Margaret Thornhill never made a decision without considering all angles. She chose Jackson not just for his character but for his skills. She knew he could run this ranch better than Charles ever could. The will also contained a personal letter to Jackson, revealing that she had been watching him work for weeks before, coincidentally, having a position available. "I recognized in you what I valued in myself," she wrote. "The determination to succeed despite every obstacle placed in your path. I offer you this partnership not from charity or sentiment, but because you've earned it through merit, the only measure that ever mattered to me." Justice came swiftly once the territorial governor took interest in the case. Charles Thornhill was convicted of murder and conspiracy, sentenced to life in the territorial prison. The banker faced charges of fraud and conspiracy, his bank seized by federal authorities. The sheriff lost his badge and faced his own trial for obstruction of justice and evidence tampering. As Charles was led away in chains, he spat final words of hatred toward Jackson. "You'll never be accepted here. They'll run you out within a year." Jackson watched silently, neither gloating nor responding to the venom. He had learned long ago that actions spoke louder than any words. In the years that followed, Jackson Reeves proved Charles wrong in every possible way. He managed the Thornhill Ranch with the same quiet competence he had shown from the beginning. Under his stewardship, the ranch not only survived but thrived, weathering economic downturns and natural disasters that bankrupted many neighboring operations. True to Margaret's wishes, Jackson opened the ranch to workers regardless of background. His bunkhouse housed cowboys of every color and origin, former slaves, Mexican vaqueros, Native Americans, and white men who valued fair treatment over prejudice. The Thornhill School, established with ranch profits, became known throughout the territory for its excellent education available to all children. Jackson never remarried, though not for lack of opportunity as his reputation and success grew. Some said he remained loyal to Margaret's memory, others believed he had found all the partnership he needed in that brief, unlikely union. By 1900, the legend of Jackson and Margaret had spread throughout the West. Their story was told around campfires and in saloons, growing more romantic with each retelling. Some versions cast them as passionate lovers overcoming societal barriers, others portrayed them as cunning partners who outwitted the corrupt establishment. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between, a complex relationship built on mutual respect, shared goals, and the recognition of worth beyond conventional measures. Their brief union had transformed not just their own lives but the entire community around them. At community gatherings, the aging Jackson would listen with amusement as younger generations recounted increasingly elaborate versions of the greatest love story in Wyoming. He never corrected them, understanding that legends serve their own purpose. If you've enjoyed this remarkable frontier tale of justice and unexpected alliance, please subscribe to our channel and share this video with others who appreciate stories of courage against overwhelming odds. The true legacy of Jackson and Margaret extended far beyond romantic legend. Their unlikely partnership demonstrated that value comes in many forms, often where least expected. They showed that justice, while sometimes delayed, can prevail against entrenched power and prejudice. Most importantly, they proved that human connection, whether brief or lasting, conventional or extraordinary, has the power to transform not just individual lives but entire communities. As the sun sets over what is still known as Thornhill Ranch, one can almost glimpse two figures in the lengthening shadows, an unlikely pair whose brief time together changed the course of the frontier and whose story continues to remind us that the most powerful legacies are built not on blood ties or social standing, but on recognition of the worth in each human heart.